All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's live cooking demonstration. Bear with me just a moment as I get the camera set up, and then we will go ahead and get started. All right. So again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Smith. I am the Wellness Program Administrator here at Georgia State University's Employee Development and Wellness Services. Today we are going to be cooking a black bean and sweet potato casserole, which is a pretty easy dish, but it makes a lot of serving, so it's great if you are trying to meal prep and have leftovers, or you're trying to make enough food for your entire household. Before we get started, just a couple quick things about the presentation today. We are going to be recording, so if you'd like to view it again later, all of our recordings are uploaded to our EDWS YouTube page. You can go there at any point and see cooking demonstrations, stretch breaks, meditation, yoga, and numerous other recordings from our services. So definitely be sure to check that out. Additionally, we're going to send out a copy of the recipe after today's presentation. So if you like what you see today, you want to give it a try, we'll be including all the instructions necessary along with the nutrition information so you can see how it might fit into your lifestyle. Throughout today's presentation, if you've got questions, comments, or maybe any technical issues that you're experiencing, please make use of the chat box in the WebEx platform. Make sure your message is set to go to all panelists. That way, Tony Pilote, who's online with me, will be able to help sort through any audio or visual issues you might be having. Any other questions or comments related to the recipe, the ingredients, nutrition, anything like that, go ahead and post those in the chat as well. And at the end of the presentation, I'll be sure to go through and address any of those. So let's go ahead and get started. The things you're going to need today in terms of equipment, you'll need a basic cutting board. We're going to use a skillet on the stovetop, and then you'll need a large baking dish that you can put in the oven. So the first step you'll want to do is preheat the oven to about 400 degrees. That's the temperature we're going to be baking at. And you'll want to have your baking dish just lightly coated with some cooking spray. But before we get into all of that and we're putting things in the baking dish, we're going to actually cook on the stovetop. So I've gone ahead and pre-chopped one of the sweet potatoes, but I'm going to go ahead and walk you through how I chop the other one here. Now, you're going to want to rinse and scrub the sweet potato well. The outside of it can collect a lot of dirt, and we want to make sure we get that off. And then you can go ahead and peel it. Once you've done that, the basic process for cutting through this is I'm going to cut this into little discs or circles, basically. And then I'm going to go through and chop them into a finer little cube dice, like about this size. So we'll go through and just start making those cuts. You'll want to avoid making them too thick. I'm doing maybe 1/4 of an inch or about 1/2 an inch, depending on how the cut goes. If they're too thick, you'll have trouble cooking it evenly. We want them all to be about the same size. Now, sweet potatoes have a pretty good reputation as being a healthy carbohydrate food. I know they are very popular in a number of different dishes, especially as we approach the fall time of year. There are a lot of fun things that people enjoy with sweet potatoes in them. They're very, very nutritious and have a lot to offer us. Real quick, I want to show you this disc shape that I cut it into. So I just made a bunch of slices like that, and you can see I make these little, almost like coins. And then I'm just going to run back through them with my knife and essentially turn it into a dice. I just make a couple cuts in each direction, and then I get that nice little cube size that I'm looking for. So we'll repeat this process going through the remaining pieces of the sweet potato. So in terms of nutrition, that bright, vibrant orange color that we see in the sweet potato comes from its vitamin A content. So it's a great source of that. It's also going to have some fiber in it, which is a nice bonus that comes with most vegetables. You're going to get a good bit of fiber. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a healthy source of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates sometimes get a bad reputation, but our body does need them. We just want to make healthier choices, and a sweet potato is a great way to do that. Now, compared to a regular potato, like a white potato, sweet potatoes do have, as I mentioned, a little more vitamin A in them. But I do want to make a note here that white potatoes are not actually bad for us. They do get a bad reputation sometimes, but all potatoes are a vegetable. They do have nutrients in them that we can fit into our diet and enjoy and make good use of. A lot of it comes down to how we prepare it. So if you have a white potato and you are frying it, adding a lot of fat to it, that's going to negatively impact the nutrition. Whether it's a sweet potato or a white potato, that's true. So it's more about the baking method and the ingredients we add to it. That's what we want to pay attention to. Otherwise, a white potato compared to a sweet potato, they both have a lot of nutritious benefits. So if you enjoy them, work those into your diet. Just do things like baking, steaming, and roasting to make them a little healthier. So what we're going to do now is, using the largest skillet you have, because we do have quite a bit of sweet potato here, I'm going to just add a tablespoon of olive oil to lubricate the pan there, and we're going to heat that over a medium heat. So rather than deep frying, we are just using a tablespoon of oil here. That's going to be ideal. And like I said, we'll put that over a medium heat real quick. Okay. So we'll let that heat up for just a second, and then what we're going to do is add the sweet potato to the top of the skillet, and we're going to cook it for about 10 to 12 minutes, stirring periodically. The idea here is that of all the different foods that we are going to be cooking today, potatoes are pretty starchy, they're very hard, they're not very tender, so we need to give them a little bit of extra care and attention and cook them on top of the stovetop first. That'll start to tenderize them, it'll begin to soften them, and then we can incorporate more of the other ingredients to then bake into the full casserole. So while we're waiting on that to heat up for just a second, I do want to point out that the only fresh ingredients required for this recipe are the sweet potato. We're going to have some green onions and some limes that'll go in as well, but everything else can be canned. So this is a great thing to keep those canned items on hand. When you need to make a meal, all you need to do is have a couple potatoes on hand and you can pretty much get the whole recipe going, which is really nice to not have to worry about the perishable side of things as much. So we'll go ahead and add these sweet potatoes to that skillet. And now, if your skillet's not quite as large as, mine's a little bit more on the medium side, so do try to flatten the potatoes out, have as many of them in contact with the pan as you can, so we'll just give it a quick stir here. We want to pick up some of that oil and make sure that it's coating all the potato pieces. All right, and we'll occasionally turn our attention back to that and just give it a little stir. In the meantime, we're going to keep an eye on the clock. We're going to let that cook for about 10 minutes. Let's talk through some of our other ingredients and get them ready as well. So in terms of the other canned goods we'll be adding here, we're going to use a small 4-ounce can of diced green chili peppers. This is going to add a little bit of interesting flavor, a little bit of spice to it. We'll also have some seasoning that'll bring in a little bit more of the heat. These are pretty mild, but just a nice 4-ounce can of it. So that's another thing you can just keep on hand. This is what they look like when they're out of the can. So those will add some nice complexity there. We're going to use a 15-ounce can of fire-roasted diced tomatoes. So these have a little bit of seasoning in them, gives it a little more flavor, but again, a nice canned item we can keep on hand. And this is just what those look like. Those look like. They're a little blackened from being fire-roasted and have a nice smell and flavor to them. We're going to use some no salt added sweet golden corn. Emphasis on the no salt added part because we're going to be adding our own salt to this recipe, just using seasoning. So we want to keep the other salt a little bit lower in other places. And now I'm going to turn my attention back over here, give it a quick stir so that none of the potatoes burn. And you will see small borders of the potatoes start to brown a little bit. They may even blacken a bit. If you notice they're getting a little too crispy, you can turn the heat down just a bit. Again, we're looking for a medium temperature because we are going to bake the sweet potatoes in with the dish a little bit later on. So the other canned ingredient we'll be including are just going to be black beans. Now, we are going to rinse and drain those. We want to get some of the extra sodium out, and we want to remove the liquid that's in it. So I'm actually using a tri-bean blend today, which is black beans, kidney beans, and pinto beans. So just a combination there. You're welcome to use just black beans if you'd like. I always enjoy the extra texture and variety that comes from having the 3 types. And then in terms of seasoning, we're going to use 2 teaspoons of chili powder to give it a little bit of a spicy kick. If you're not as big of a fan of spicy foods or they may agitate you a little bit, you can actually leave the chili powder out. You'll still have plenty of good flavor in here, but that spice is nice with this southwestern dish. 1 teaspoon of ground cumin, Again, giving it more of that southwestern feel. We're going to use just a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Like I mentioned, we're trying to keep the salt a little bit lower, keep it heart healthy. We are going to be adding some cheese to it because it's a casserole and that makes them delicious. So we're being mindful of the total salt going in. Then we'll use a 1/4 teaspoon of black pepper. Again, just giving it a little bit more flavor variety, a little more depth there. And then in terms of the green onions and the limes, those are not going to be directly involved in the cooking process. They are going to be sort of garnish and add some additional flavor on top at the end. That being said, we can go ahead and prep them. So I'm going to go ahead and do that while we're cooking those sweet potatoes. Before I cut into them though, I am going to turn around and give those sweet potatoes just another quick stir. Again, we want to be mindful of it. We don't want anything to burn. So during that 10-minute time frame, just make sure you're paying attention to it. Okay, so those are coming along nicely. So when it comes to scallions or green onions, those are the same thing. You'll buy them in a bunch, and you'll want to make sure to give them a rinse, just like you would any other fruit or vegetable before you eat it. Now, the green parts at the top are definitely more flavorful, and they've got a better texture. That's usually what people prefer. Technically, you can eat the parts that get a little bit whiter as you approach the bulb of them, but most people don't enjoy the texture or flavor as much, so you can make a decision about where you want to cut them off at. Of course, the higher up you cut, the more of the scallion that you're going to discard, but we're aiming mainly for those green tips. Now, we don't need a ton here. They come in a bunch, but we're just going to get a handful of it to sort of garnish the top of the dish. If you saw the photo at the beginning of today's presentation, you can see those specks of green, and that's where that's coming from. So in terms of cutting this, I'm just going to try to line up the tips, and we're just going to run the knife through it, making small cuts like so. Now what I'm doing is I'm using a pinch grip to protect my fingers, so if the knife hits something, it'll hit my knuckle and not my fingertip. That's important. And I'm not moving the knife so much as I am moving the green onions towards the knife and doing sort of a rocking motion with it to just cut those up. So we've got a nice amount here. You can see them diced finely, so that's exactly what we're looking for when we put that on the dish. If you notice any missed cuts as you're doing that, maybe they weren't lined up right, you can always run the knife back through them like that, but scallions cut pretty easily, so that's usually a simple step. So I'm going to move these over to the side of my cutting board. Those are good to go to garnish and add a little extra flavor. And then what we're going to do with the limes is, in terms of presentation, we'll put the lime wedges on top of the casserole just because it looks kind of fancy and that's nice. But ultimately, you'll squeeze out the lime juice on top, bringing that nice acidic, bright flavor to the southwestern, smokier flavors that are going to be involved. So we're pairing a little bit of the acid with some of that savory, and it's just a really nice combination. So all I'm really going to do, I'm going to get some of the green onions off the knife here, is just cut this into quarters, basically. So nothing too fancy here. If you want to, you can make smaller slices than that. If you want to divvy it up more throughout the entire casserole, that's up to you. But I think these quarter pieces will do nicely, and we'll be able to easily squeeze out that juice. So we are getting closer to that 10-minute mark on this. I'm going to give it a quick stir again. And even though we don't have any seasoning on the potatoes, they smell really good to me. I am a huge fan of potatoes, like most people are, and just the smell of them starting to cook on there is really nice. But once we add in the seasoning blend and some of these other ingredients, we're really going to bring out the flavor. And again, we are cooking the sweet potatoes entirely by themselves, just in that tablespoon of oil to start off with, because they are so starchy and tough. We need to soften them. And what we're doing is whenever you apply heat to it, we're actually breaking down those carbohydrates a little bit. We're simplifying them. That's what produces the tenderness and the softness and gets rid of some of that rigidity. It also produces a bit of a sweeter flavor, hence the name sweet potato, which we tend to find really pleasant. So that softening, that sweetening, it all comes together really nice, and that's just some of the science behind how that heat affects the structure of the food. Something that's just really interesting that we don't always think about that much. So the last ingredient we haven't talked about as much is going to be the cheese that we're going to be using. Now, you can make a choice here about what kind of cheese you'd like to use. You can use just cheddar cheese. I'm using a Fiesta blend or a Mexican blend, which has a couple of different kinds of cheeses in it. This one is Monterey Jack, cheddar, queso cheese, and then an asadero cheese. So a couple different varieties mixed together there to give it some flavor. You can use regular cheese, but if you're looking to cut the calories of this recipe a little bit, you could certainly go with a lower fat version of the cheese or a reduced fat version of the cheese. That's entirely up to you. The nutrition information or the nutrition setup is designed to allow this to be a healthy, balanced dish, even if you're using full fat cheese, because that is our main source of fat aside from just the tablespoon of olive oil that we'll be including. So I'm going to give this one more stir, and then we're going to start adding in the other ingredients. So we're seeing a little bit of browning on the sweet potato. It's probably hard to see from where the camera is, but the browning is not actually the best indication. What we want to see is that the potatoes are a little tender, a little soft to the touch. So using a fork and seeing if you're able to poke into it somewhat easily, that's a good indicator. They don't need to be fully cooked, but we do want it to, release some of that tension, let the fork go in fairly easily. That's how we know it's ready. If you're not quite there yet, consider cooking for another 2 minutes or so, just checking on it periodically. And then at that point, we'll go ahead and add in the seasoning. So again, we're doing 2 teaspoons of chili powder, a teaspoon of cumin, a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and a 1/4 teaspoon of black pepper. We're going to add those in and give it a quick stir and let it cook for about 30 seconds, and the sweet potato will start to pick up all that flavoring. So now I'm just going to mix it around, make sure all those sweet potato pieces are coated in that good flavor. And this is when the smells really start to get good in the kitchen, because I think for me, as soon as the cumin and the chili powder hit that sweet potato, it really goes up in the air. You can start to smell it. It kind of reminds me of when people make like hash browns in the morning, or if you're doing a Southwestern breakfast, a lot of similar scents. So I really enjoy those. So now we've added the seasoning. We stirred it, let it cook for about 30 seconds. We're going to dump in the fire roasted tomatoes and the green chilies. Now, again, these were canned items. You do want to drain them in a colander first to get off the excess liquid. It's okay if there's a little bit of liquid in them still, that's normal, but we just don't want to pour in too much liquid or it's going to steam a whole bunch. We don't want that to happen excessively. So once you've done that, go ahead and dump in the whole can of the green chilies and those fire roasted tomatoes and give those a stir as well. And just to give you a better view of what we're working with at this point, so you can see all those colors coming together. They're bright orange, they're red, a little bit of the green in there. It smells delicious. We're going to let this cook for about 2 minutes. So while that's cooking, it's going to bring out more of the flavor in the chili and the tomatoes. Any of the excess liquid that might have been in there will start to evaporate. You'll see some steam rising off of it. So again, about 2 minutes of cooking there. And then the next ingredients that will get geared up are going to be the corn, the beans, and the cheese. So we are using 3/4 of a cup of corn. Something I want to note is that that is not the full can. So you don't need to use the entire can of corn. You're welcome to if you want to, but we're just keeping it to a 3/4 cup amount. That's sort of balancing the carbohydrates between the sweet potato, the beans, and the corn, because we do have a couple of different healthy sources here. So we are going to go ahead and dump these in now, so the black beans and the corn. And at this point, I'm going to remove it from the heat because these are all going to go in the oven together. So I'm going to add in 3/4 of a cup of our shredded cheese, and we're just going to mix it around. The cheese will melt a little bit, but it's not our full goal to melt it entirely right now. That's going to happen when it's in the baking dish. So I've got about 3/4 of a cup here. All right, I've added that in, and now I'm just going to give it a stir. Okay, starting to look really good. As soon as you add cheese to something, I get really excited. It almost looks like a big thing of sweet potato nachos. So something to note here is my skillet, because it's a little bit on the smaller side, you can see how full it is. So stirring becomes a little bit of a technical challenge. If you've got a larger skillet, that may not be a problem. But at this point, the baking pan that we have sprayed with cooking spray, we're gonna transfer this to it. So if your skillet's a little on the smaller side, no big deal. Just move this all into the skillet, or not into the skillet, sorry, into the baking dish, and then you can stir it in there, and we'll spread it out into an even layer. I'm going to just actually set this down right here for now. So for the sake of time today, after you've spread this into a baking dish, you're gonna coat it with foil, and you're gonna put it in the oven, again at 400 degrees, for about 15 minutes. Afterwards, you'll remove the foil and let it cook uncovered for 8 additional minutes. Because we're on a limited time schedule, we're gonna skip that step today. The recipe will fully include that instructions about covering it with the foil, how long to bake it for, so on and so forth. And we'll go ahead and jump ahead to what the dish looks like after you've baked it. So let me grab my completed dish. Okay, so it's still a little hot, so I'm gonna be careful. So hopefully you can get a pretty good view of that, but that just looks so good to me. All the black beans, the sweet potatoes, the chilies and the tomatoes. It's got that nice coating of cheese on top, which really, really adds some savory gooiness to it. And now we're gonna just dress it up a little bit. So those scallions that we cut earlier, we can sprinkle a couple of those around. It's gonna add some interesting flavor to it, but I think honestly more than that, a lot of that is just for presentation. You can even see on the camera here, even though it's far away, little flecks of green. It does a lot to us to make us excited for the dish. Whenever we are eager to have food, numerous things contribute to our appetite. There's just our natural hunger, but if you've ever walked into a room where something smells really good and you've had that feeling before, you start to feel a little hungrier. So smell plays a role, but so does sight. The way that food looks can significantly change how excited we are to eat it. So having a blend of colors here can enhance that. And then lastly, I'm just going to place some of these lime wedges in there, and we'll, like I mentioned, what we're gonna do whenever it's time to eat it is we'll give the lime a squeeze, getting some fresh lime on there. If you don't wanna buy fresh lime, you can definitely just use bottled lime juice. But again, for presentation, making it look nice, I think the lime wedges are a nice touch. Plus, it's hard to beat fresh squeezed lime juice. So let me get the oven mitt back on just, well, let's see. That's not too hot, I can pick that up. So that is our completed dish. Hopefully you're able to see that on the camera there. The photo at the beginning definitely shows a better picture, but you'll be able to see that in the recipe. So this is a really, really easy dish. It's mostly using canned goods. If you're not very experienced with cooking, really the only challenging part, I guess, would be chopping up the sweet potato, and you pretty much just cook that on top of the skillet for 10 minutes and then add everything else in. So the recipe will cover it, but the steps that we skipped is moving your completed skillet into a baking dish, layering that flat, and then topping it with that foil and baking it in the oven for about 15 minutes, then removing the foil and baking for another 8, and then you're good to go. So this produces quite a few servings. You can tell it's fairly large. Now, depending on how big your servings are, it will adjust the calories a bit, but it's designed to get you about 8 servings at about 250 calories a piece. So you could certainly have bigger servings if you wanted to have it as a full meal. You could pair it with something else. If you are a meat eater, I know some grilled chicken on top of this would be awesome. I think it would really bring out, you know, we're going for, again, kind of a Southwestern vibe. Grilled chicken is frequently found in those dishes. You could also enhance it with some more vegetables, doing a side salad to pair nicely with it. Or like I mentioned, you could absolutely just eat it as is. In terms of storage, you'll want to cover it. Most baking dishes will come with a nice little lid like this that'll snap on top of them, and you can keep it in the fridge for up to 4 days. You're welcome to eat it cold whenever you want to have it, but I do recommend microwaving it or even just heating it on a skillet for a little bit to bring that warmth back in. That'll melt the cheese again, and I think it's best served warm, though I'm a fan of cold leftovers as well, so I'll leave that up to you. So we're going to take a moment to look at the chat here real quick, keeping an eye on the time. I saw a question about how to store it, so we just covered that, yeah, and that'll also be included on the recipe. So when you get that recipe emailed to you, you'll be able to see all the storage information as well. I see some comments about how it looks. I'm glad it looks good to people. Sometimes I'm worried that like it looks really good to me here, but maybe the camera's not picking up on it, which is why we show those photos at the beginning to try to enhance it. But I'm glad some of that's still coming through. As always, I wish you could smell it and taste it, but hopefully you'll be able to make it yourself at home and enjoy it. Here's a question. My husband is not a fan of beans. What could we trade them out for? That's a great question. So in terms of this dish, what the beans are adding is they're adding some more fiber, which always a good thing, but we do have fiber coming from the corn, the tomatoes, the green chilies, the sweet potatoes. We've actually got a lot of fiber in the dish already, so pulling the beans out, not the end of the world. Because this is a plant-based dish though, the biggest sources of protein are the beans and the cheese, meaning that if you remove the beans, we are gonna dip down in the protein content a little bit. We wanna keep the protein there because it helps us feel full and satisfied and supports our muscles. So if you want to pull the beans out, what I might recommend doing is earlier I mentioned adding something like grilled chicken to this, adding in another protein. You could also do some ground beef with it, maybe some ground turkey, making it a little leaner, keeping it heart healthy. That will add some of that protein back in if you decide to pull the beans out. So think of this as our plant-based protein, and if you want to replace it with a lean animal protein, that's a good substitution nutritionally. So hopefully that's helpful. Here's another question. Can you use frozen, diced, or cut sweet potatoes? Very, very good question. So we did a little work today with the raw sweet potatoes, cutting them up. I love this recipe because I mentioned most of the stuff is just canned, which really saves us a lot of time. If you want to save time even more by using frozen diced sweet potatoes, absolutely, go for it. Essentially what you'll do is follow the instructions on the frozen sweet potatoes to get them thawed and heated up and pretty much cooked, keeping in mind that since we are going to bake them with all the other ingredients, they're gonna cook a little bit longer than they normally would. You might find some texture differences between the frozen that you're reheating and the fresh ones, but it's a casserole. You know, everything just kind of comes together and tastes good, so you can definitely make that work. Just follow the instructions on the bag and then add in the rest of the ingredients, and you should be able to sync back up with the rest of the recipe. But I love the idea of making it even simpler. Here's a question about, are the green chilies spicy? They are very, very mild. There's a little bit of heat to them. We added some chili pepper in here, which is adding a little bit of additional heat. But I would say if you're not crazy about spicy food, this is a overall very, very mild dish. If you're worried about it, you can take them out. And honestly, you could substitute a number of other canned vegetables if you just wanted to add something to replace it, make it a little more interesting. But if you're worried about heat, like I said, super mild. If you like spicy stuff, definitely go for it. Add in things that are even hotter than that with a higher temperature there. I think that could make it more fun too. Okay. So I don't see any more questions at this point in time. So just as a reminder, keep an eye out in your email. We're going to send a copy of the recipe, a link to the recording, which we upload to our YouTube page, and you'll also get a quick survey. If you could take 2 to 3 minutes to fill that out, let us know what you thought of today's session, what went well, what we could improve on. We'd love to hear it. We're always looking for that feedback. With that being said, if you are not already on our mailing list, we do send out reminders for our cooking demonstrations and all of our other events every single week. If you're not already on the list, you can email us at edws@gsu.edu, and we'll get you added so you can stay up to date on all of our different events. Speaking of, tomorrow is Friday, and we'll be having a guided meditation and chair yoga session from 12 to 1:30 virtually. So if you're interested in attending that, we definitely encourage you to join us for that. Have a nice, relaxing little session on Friday before we head into the weekend. And I see Tony has put the email in the chat. Thank you, Tony. So again, if you're not on our mailing list, send us an email and we'll get that fixed for you. Otherwise, thank you everyone so much for attending today. Keep an eye out for that email and have a great rest of your day.